where the spirit meets the bone. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer. If you're a pretender, come sit by my fire, for we have some flax golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. The Gospel according to Shel Silverstein. We have some flax golden tales to spin this month. And my mom, the minister mom, Laurel, often talks with her congregation about gathering in the sanctuary like they're gathering under a great story tree. She says, come on in, come up to the chancel and gather under our great story tree. I think this might be another name for the tree of life, the great story tree, canopy wide enough to hold the story's every shade and texture, trunk sturdy enough not to be crumpled by their contradictions and inconsistencies, roots deep enough to keep finding new nutrients, new characters, new twists and turns. I've sometimes fantasized about an artist coming into our sanctuary. It would have to be in the middle of the night in my imagination. An artist coming in the middle of the night, sneaking into our building and taking those pillars, the white pillars in our sanctuary, and turning them into trees, great story trees. Now, I'm not up to speed on all this, but my understanding is that neuroscientists have been proving recently in the last decade or two, just how important stories are for how our brains work. It's how we make sense of the world. And I love this turn of phrase. You may have heard this from me before. A fact might be the smallest unit of information, but a story is the smallest unit of meaning. A story is the smallest unit of meaning. And I imagine our ancestors, millennia upon millennia back, maybe 100,000 or 200,000 years ago, ancestors of our ancestors, first gathering around the fire, first circling around and telling stories to one another, building human community, a primal force, this storytelling circle of stories, a primal force in our becoming human. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie cautions, stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used, she says, to dispossess and to malign. But stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but can also repair that broken dignity. Stories can be used to sell products by branding experts. Stories can be used to sell promises from politicians. Stories can be used in therapy to put a person back together. Stories can reveal reality more clearly, and stories can also obscure reality. You know those moments, I think that we all have them, when reality suddenly shakes you out of a story that you've been living in. It could be as simple as discovering a word you thought you knew is pronounced entirely different than you thought, or even has a different meaning. Some of us may have been living in a story that we as a culture, we pretty much figured out racism, gotten through it, made it all better. And then someone goes and puts cameras in all of our pockets, and suddenly we can't escape the reality that lynchings are still happening in our country. Awakening from a story that obscured reality. Reality can wake us up from the stories that would turn us away from it. And then there are those moments when it's the story itself that wakes us up to what is, to reality. when the story comes together and suddenly all of the disparate parts of our experience make sense. It's that moment in the detective novel when the brilliant detective reveals how all the clues fit together. It takes all the little moments, the fragmented bits and pieces of experience, and weaves from them a story to make it all make sense. The story itself reveals reality more clearly. Sometimes people healing from trauma have a similar experience, moments when a key to understanding clicks into place and suddenly all the jagged moments come into stark relief. So we live in stories. Stories shape our lives, and therefore it behooves us, I think, to understand something about how stories work. So that's why we'll be talking about this all month from different angles. So I thought we'd start with the end and the middle and the beginning. You probably know I love a good fantasy story, maybe nothing more than an epic fantasy, the kind that gets so long and intricate that the author dies before it can be finished. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't stop me from reading them. You might know Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time was one of these epic fantasy series, and every book began like this. You'd write that the wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legends fade to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the third age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the mountains of mist. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings or endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. Neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, or perhaps really ever ending, ever beginning. And I've been thinking about how here in our community, in this place where we are privileged to live, it's starting to feel like we're moving towards the end of our pandemic story, the end of intense restrictions. Think about those sacred first hugs people are giving and receiving after so long apart. And there, even in the story of an ending, we feel drawn into a beginning. What will this next chapter bring? And also we know that elsewhere, for most of the world, the end of pandemic restrictions is not impending. Most places are still squarely in the middle of this story. So here's my story. I think we're always living through beginnings, middles, and endings all at once, because we're always living in so many stories and we can tell our stories in so many ways. So I wonder if you would, for a moment, reflect on what story is on your mind this morning. What story are you living in? If you were to name the chapter of your life that you are living right now, what would its title be? If you're willing, I invite you to just go ahead and put that in the chat. Where is spirit meeting bone for you right now? How would you title the chapter you're in? I can tell my story in so many ways. I can tell you about the guy who dropped out of college twice, has struggled with mental health and got divorced after a 6-year marriage. That's my story. And I could tell you about the guy who got straight A's and graduated from seminary at 25 and has a thriving ministry and a happy child. That's also my story. I sometimes find myself telling the story of the end I'm in. And sometimes I'm telling the story of the new horizon just forming at the edge of my vision. Sometimes I'm plodding through the middle, just trying to get the next task done. I sometimes turn to our local sage, Anne Lamott, for wisdom, and I've been reading Bird by Bird. She talks in that book, you might know this, about KFKD radio, the stories that play. And for KFKD, I'm not going to articulate it the way that she does, but you sound it out, KFKD, and you get the sense of what she's talking about. This radio station that she says, if you're not careful, station KFKD will play in your head 24 hours a day, nonstop in stereo. Out of the right speaker in your inner ear will come the endless stream of self-aggrandizement, the recitation of one's specialness, of how much more open and gifted and brilliant and knowing and misunderstood and humble one is. And out of the left speaker will be the rap songs of self-loathing, the lists of all the things one doesn't do well, of all the mistakes one has made today and over an entire lifetime, the doubt, the assertion that everything one touches turns to shit, and that one doesn't do relationships well, that one is in every way a fraud, incapable of selfless love, that one has no talent or insight, and on and on and on. KFKD. If we're not careful, it will play in your head 24 hours a day, nonstop in stereo. And so if you are living in the rut of your KFKD stories, it's time to tell it a different way. Maybe you notice yourself relaying again and again the same sense of living a bitter ending. Or perhaps you're always flailing about in the middle and it feels like you've lost the plot. Or sometimes I know I've been perpetually looking for a new beginning, hooked on that excitement of the energy of the new. And if you notice you're in a rut, maybe look for another story. If you're stuck on an ending, what beginning might you be experiencing right now too? Or if you're stuck in a role, feeling perpetually like the villain or hero, how would you tell your story if you were instead to be nominated for Best Supporting Actor or Actress? Or what if you were the Shakespearean fool in this story, adding comedic interlude and wise commentary? And in our story together, our shared story, where are we? As we finish a third year of our developmental ministry together, there's so much to reflect on. I know for some of us, the end of the 5 years now is starting to feel like a looming horizon. And we'll talk more about it in the weeks and months to come, certainly at our congregational meeting next month. But this is one of the reasons that I hope you'll make time for one of those listening circles this month. Now is a good moment to reflect together on where we've been these last 3 years, where we're going for the next 2. We're in the middle of this story still, but we're also feeling an ending arriving, another beginning arising. And we know that we are living in these layers in the story of our larger world right now as well. I've heard it named recently that we're living through a polycrisis. Crises of racial and economic justice, of climate catastrophe, of pandemic, of skyrocketing numbers of refugees. In the Buddhist teacher and systems scholar Joanna Macy's estimation, we are living through the inevitable end of the industrial growth society. And we can tell this story as an ending, as the great unraveling, she names it. But we could also tell it as a beginning, a great turning. And of course, we're still right in the middle of it. all true, all containing kernels of reality to awaken us. These chapter titles are beautiful. New Beginnings, Shangri-La, Where the Wild Things Are. The chrysalis opens, Relief, Remembering Phil, The Dawn of Empty Nesting, The Beginning of Retirement, In Full Bloom, Balancing Growth with Overwhelm, What's Really Important. Life on the Road for an Adventure, Making Friends, New Beginnings with Yellow and Green Nature, Anticipation. I think about how we weave our stories together, our chapters titled from all of those stories we've inherited, taking all the stories we've been given and fashioning, authoring a new story for ourselves. And I thought about this while I was working on Henry's bed. You might have heard me talk about Henry's bed in a check-in. It was the only thing I could think about for a couple of weeks, because as I was settling into this new home and wanting to make sure that Henry felt at home here, I had a bed given to me by my sperm donor. I've only ever talked with my sperm donor a handful of times, but he had a bed, the bed from his childhood, that he offered me just as I was getting ready to move. And so one day my brother and I headed up to Sebastopol, where his parents live, where he grew up. And we loaded his childhood bed that was a special bed because it was salvaged off of a ship. His parents had a salvaging business. And it was not in the best condition. It had been stored for decades. This old ship's bed in the garage. And as we carried it home, I wondered if I was crazy to be taking on restoring this bed. And as I worked to sand it down, the many days spent out in the driveway thinking about all the other things that I wished I was doing, living in the story of why am I still in the middle of this one when I need to be starting the next project? As I worked to sand the bed down, I thought many times about the comment my brother made when we were looking at it, deciding whether to take it home or not. He said, well, you could just take the front of it and screw it on to a nice new IKEA bed. and I thought a few times, that's really what I should have done. It's not like Henry really cares at this point. But as I finished staining and assembling, screwing this bed all together, getting it set up in his room, I had the thought, well, at the very least, after all of this work, at the very least, it'll make a good story. And I do think sometimes that's what it comes down to, making sense of our lives. At the very least, it'll make a good story. I'm writing a new ending with a better storyline. Turn the page and leave the blanks with a plot that's less defined. And though I won't get back a day of stolen time, I could go to bed at night with a better storyline. May your pages leave room for blanks. May your storylines heal, nourish, excite, and overwhelm you with their aliveness. May it be so.